elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Well, welcome to the Society and the State podcast. I'm Brian Hyde along with Connor Boyack, and we're going to talk about medicine today. And Connor, you would think medicine shouldn't be a controversial thing, right? Should be pretty straightforward, but it turns out medicine has just become more and more politicized and more controversial as time goes on. Any thoughts as to why that has happened?
I think anytime you're talking about something that involves danger to public health, there's a natural presumption to involve the government, right? You look at occupational licensure, and under the guise of protecting public health and safety, you've seen occupational licensure rise from half a century ago when 1 in 20 workers in America needed a permission slip, and now it's 1 in 3. And so I think all this is predicated on something that's underlying, and it makes sense, right? Like you don't want, mislabeled stuff, and you don't want dangerous people doing things. And so the motives, the reasons I think are pure, but the outgrowth from that initial justification becomes massive.
I think if we look back at history, where doctors became doctors, there was a time when it was not the highly regimented, regulated kind of practice that it is now. In fact, you go back even to just prior to the Civil War, there were schools that doctors could go to, but the kind of licensure and the, I want to say almost exclusionary kind of schooling, well, if you don't go here, then you can't really be considered a doctor, were not the norm. Which meant you had people out there with varying degrees of practical skill in medicine, but somehow it worked.
Yeah, I certainly think you have guild-like tendencies today where if you're not a member of the guild, if you're not a member, if you're not licensed, then you are inherently forbidden from holding yourself out as a physician. It reminds me of this Swedish engineer. I believed he lived in Washington or Oregon, and his wife got a red light ticket from one of those cameras that take your picture. So she gets this in the mail. And she had crossed on a yellow, apparently, and so he was worried that the algorithm used by these cameras was inadequate. So he came up with a recommendation that could be used to improve the formula. And in doing so, in offering this, he called himself an engineer. Well, he was censured by that state's official, division of whatever licensing committee. And, he got like a $500 fine and everything. And in their formal conclusion, it was he held himself out as an engineer. He had engineering experience and he had engineering knowledge. And the very fact that he did this, but that he called himself an engineer, was a problem. So this gatekeeping, this guild-like tendency is something we see in the medical community. And I think that's to the detriment of health overall.
So I got to ask the question, were his calculations correct?
I don't know that they were ever implemented or considered. I think the whole licensure issue shut that down, right?
It just shows you how ridiculous it is, though. I mean, he could have been 100% correct, but that's not what the state was concerned about. Nobody was hurt by his calculations.
We've talked on a previous episode about the case of the staircase that the gentleman built, and because he didn't have the right permits and he wasn't the right person to do it, the city paid to have that torn down and taken apart, even though it was a fully functional and adequate project that this guy did. So that this tendency to this pro-licensure, pro-regulation thing, I think, has seeped in the medical community. In Utah, where we're at, we're trying to legalize medical cannabis right now. And I have to laugh because one of the opposition's talking points, and in this case, by opposition, I mean the Utah Medical Association, they don't represent all the physicians, but they do represent many. Their position is that we can't call this medical cannabis or medical marijuana because it's not FDA approved. And that's their main contention. They're like, if you want to call it like naturopathic or alternative or therapeutic, fine,
really?
But you can't call it medical. To which I say, wait a minute. So before the FDA came along, nothing in the history of the world was medical. Nothing in other countries is medical, right? Like FDA approval is what is necessary. Oh, and all those things that the FDA have recalled, they were once medical. Are they still medical? Right? So I think that's a big problem that we see in medicine when it is politicized, is that only when it has bureaucratic blessing is it sanctioned and safe and okay and permissible.
And that's what I was hoping we could explore a little bit today. I'm a fan of medical self-sufficiency, but I want to preface that before going any further by saying, look, if I was having a heart attack, you better believe the first place I would be going is the best medical center that is close by. I want the benefits of emergency medicine. So my goal here isn't to try to paint what we call traditional medicine as somehow, evil or unnecessary. But it's curious to me how hostile traditional medicine and particularly some of its bureaucratic overlords are when it comes to naturopathic rather, or homeopathic remedies. They're very skeptical. For instance, vitamins or herbs. If you have vitamins and herbs, I know that they undergo kind of similar scrutiny. Someone who says, hey, this walnut extract is wonderful for this, the FDA could very well be breathing down their necks because you're making health claims or you're making claims that you don't have a right to make. And so I want to explore a little bit the idea of to what degree ought we be medically self-sufficient, and to what degree is government willing to let us be medically self-sufficient?
I think maybe one place to start is with the individual, as in all these cases, that the individual has the right to ingest whatever he or she wants, right? Certainly if that ingestion is going to cause harm on others, if you're driving under the influence or if you're exchanging with minors who don't have, sufficient capacity to consent and understand the implications of what they're doing, right? Carving all of that out, which makes sense, and certainly we can concede. If I want to ingest, bath salts or chlorine or whatever, I'm an idiot for doing so, right? But people do damage to themselves all the time. People commit suicide, horrible, horrible stuff, right? But the individual has the right to consume a product that they think may benefit from them. To criminalize the ingestion of something that does not have sufficient political blessing, I think, is an inherent injustice and one of the baseline problems with medicine today. Medical cannabis, as I mentioned a moment ago, is a great example of that. I think what the FDA, what federal regulations, certainly state regulations need to shift to is more of a buyer beware approach. So whether you want to do allopathic or homeopathic or whatever pathic, right? Like, fine. But we're just going to have disclosures and we're going to have buyer beware, and you're going to understand that this has not been reviewed, this has not been studied, you're on your own. So, how do we get there?
Truth be told, what you just described, though, should apply even to people who are taking FDA-approved medications.
For sure.
How, like you had mentioned before, how many times has the FDA had to come back and go, whoops, sorry, turns out that one dissolves the valves in your heart. Our bad.
And that's the problem. The presumption of government blessing is that it conveys, what's the right word I'm looking for? It conveys safety, legitimacy. And so the presumption is that whatever the government sanctions is okay. And then people don't do their homework, right? If we had the regime that you and I are talking about, a system in which it was buyer beware across the board, even for the government, people would probably be a lot more cautious and they would weigh things out. They would talk to others who have used them. They would read reviews, much like buying something on Amazon or eating somewhere on Yelp. And so we need to get to that system where people are making more informed decisions. I want to share a tangential example that comes to mind right now. I shared this at the end of, I believe it was Latter-day Responsibility, one of my books, and it was a fascinating example. There was this European country where a traffic engineer was tasked with redesigning a very clogged intersection. I can't remember the country, but it was somewhere in Central Eastern Europe. And he changed it to, he eliminated all the traffic signs, all of them. It was this massive thing before that had all these traffic signs and be careful here and you're going to turn here. And the amazing thing, so Wired did a huge profile on this some years ago, and they went out and they interviewed this traffic engineer. They're standing on the side of the road. They're watching all these cars go by. No accidents, right? Safe, everything else. And the reporter asked this guy, like, how did you accomplish this? How is it that this is working? There's no signs. And the point of it was when there's signs up, people are looking at the signs. They're taking their direction from the sign. And once they get past that sign, they're looking for the next one. And, oh, that one's telling me where I need to go now. And the problem, especially in a community like that where there are a lot of pedestrians walking around and bicyclists and everything like that, is that as looking at the signs, you're not looking at others. And as you know, when you're driving, like the cues that you can get from that guy driving and, oh, wait, is he going? Am I? Just those like little, very subtle cues are very powerful in changing our behavior. And so if we're not looking to one another, if we're looking at some authority, we're going to miss out on those cues. Taking it back to our example, I think that's where we get to in buyer beware is if we're looking at others, other reviews, other stories, and so forth, the data, then we can make a more informed decision with those cues with that input. But if we're looking at authority, not only are we going to swallow things that might kill us, we're going to be deprived of things that can benefit us.
I think that was a perfect example to use, because has there ever been a time in human history when it's been easier to go do your homework or to sort out the facts and compare?
Absolutely. But here's the challenge. In looking to authority, we are undermining our own endeavor. And here's what I mean by that. There's a gentleman by the name of John Arnold. He was profiled about a year ago. This might have also been in Wired. Made a bunch of money in hedge fund, whatever. And he is steering a lot of his money towards reproducibility studies. What do I mean by that? You hear all the time on the news, a new study shows that X, Y, and Z, and if you take half a chocolate bar before bed, you're going to increase your life by 10 years, right? And if you...
if only.
Exactly. 4 glasses of wine before lunch is going to, allow you to sleep better by 23%. So there's all these studies that keep coming out. And it makes sense because the incentive to fund research is around these flashy studies and really innovative stuff. What the problem is that actual science? Is it true? And so you hear this on the news, you see these things, and there's a new study. Science, it must be true. And what he found, actually the Stanford School of Medicine, they performed an analysis that suggests that approximately 90%, 90, not 19, 90% of medical research is likely false. And then the pharmaceutical industry, they did their own analysis and estimated that 70% of published cancer studies cannot be reproduced. Okay. And then you found there was this huge project, 250 researchers conducted replications of 100 published studies. They found that only 39% of the studies could be reproduced. If it's science, if it's the scientific method, if this stuff is safe and healthy and whatever, you're going to be able to reproduce it. Someone else is going to be able to do what you've done and say, no, this is safe. No, this is true. We have verified this. But there's no incentive to do reproducibility studies. So this guy, John Arnold, is steering a lot of his money to doing just that, to show what a problem there is in the scientific community. And when the scientific community, through regulatory capture, has become in bed with the regulators themselves, you look at the revolving doors at a lot of these pharmaceutical companies and the FDA, and the current president of FDA was the former guy at Monsanto, and vice versa. You get what's called regulatory capture. The very people who are supposed to be regulated capture or take control in part of the regulating system. So all these studies come out, and if they're not reproduced, the government is giving its rubber stamp to things that can be harmful. Meanwhile, there's all these potential other cures and treatments and so forth that don't have the funding behind it, don't have all the money to do it. And then we're denied that opportunity because it can't get rubber stamped.
I have a friend who's a naturopathic physician, and to understand the kind of training that he had to do, every bit of medical school, including the biochemistry, all the hard stuff, the hard medical sciences, he had to study all of that before he went to his specialty, which is naturopathy. And I just want to contrast that with that dependence on science like you were just describing. We're entering cold and flu season. So it's a good bet somebody within the sound of our voices is going to be fighting a nasty chest cold or just congestion and that miserable feeling. I'm going to share with you a remedy that my friend Dr. Joe shared with me that it is not scientifically based, or at least I'm not aware of any scientific explanation, but I will tell you from firsthand experience it actually worked. And it's called wet socks. So if you or your kid, you feel like you've got a fever and maybe you're getting a little bit congested in your chest and just that miserable feeling of a good, nasty cold coming on. Here's what you want to do. You want to get a pair of wool socks. You want to get a bowl of ice water with ice cubes in it. And you soak the socks in the ice water and wring them out just to where they're not dripping wet, but they are thoroughly saturated with that cold water. Then you put them on your feet. You put another pair of socks over the top of them, just regular athletic socks or even a, poly cotton blend sock, and go to bed. And it's uncomfortable. I mean, you got cold, wet socks on your feet. And so that first 10 minutes or so kind of sucks. But then you drift off to sleep. And when you wake up in the morning, the socks are dry and congestion is lessened. Now, I don't know how that works. I don't understand it. Even Dr. Joe says, I don't know the scientific principles behind it, but somehow it stimulates your body and stimulates the systems in your body to where they start to go to work on the problem. And part of it is warming up the socks. And I know this sounds fantastical and like, maybe I should be looking into tea leaves as well to see what I should do next. But I'm telling you, it works. And I've used it on myself and I've used it on my kids. And I have no scientific reason to do so, but I'm grateful to have that tool at my disposal.
Well, I get congested quite often. I have a deviated septum, and things are often quite clogged up there for me. And I use occasionally I'll use the Breathe essential oil that I'll put on there, and man, that stuff clears me out like crazy, and then I'm fine for a while. So again, like, what's the financial incentive to study this sock theory? Like, who's going to go and fund a study based on that? And honestly, I think a lot of these things may occasionally be attributed to a placebo effect. Maybe the very belief, our minds are insanely powerful. I love studying the human brain, and if you've convinced your brain to think that is in fact true, let's take the assumption that it's false, just for conversation, that what you just said is not true, but you believe it is, and the very fact of you doing it triggers your body to release the right chemicals and hormones to address the problem. Great.
It's hard to argue with the results, even if I can't explain them. And I guess the point in sharing that is, it sounds nutty and it sounds counterintuitive, and yet there seems to be some basis in reality just by virtue of the fact I've seen it work. And so I'm urging, keep an open mind. Obviously, there are times if I have a severe infection in my lungs, I am definitely going to want, the appropriate antibiotics before it becomes life-threatening. But there's a lot that we could be taking care of without medical intervention or without, going to the hospital or Instacare or the doctor. And I would encourage people, learn those skills, or at least examine those skills. You might be surprised how many things you can take care of yourself. I mean, who knows? Next thing you do, you'll be doing home birth, right?
Been there, done that.
Have you?
My wife, not myself. But yeah, I mean, same thing. Like we I hadn't planned to discuss that, but thinking about it now, like reviewing all the complications from maternal health and newborns in hospitals, the very fact that hospitals are full of germs and super bacteria, and you're not sick. This is a very natural thing. Looking at other countries that aren't so hospital intensive, looking at some of the history. In fact, it was Ricky Lake who did a documentary. I can't remember the name, but she did a whole documentary on home birthing, or birthing, I should say. And it was fascinating to look in other countries and compare it to America, and looking back in the 50s and 60s, the massive financial incentives that creeped their way into the medical system that induced women to go into the hospitals, the fear-mongering that they were able to put out through the news media to say how dangerous it is, and you got to come to the safety of the hospital, and the costs going up, and the money that was made, and the very fact that they kick you out quickly because they free up a bed, and it's this conveyor belt system. And we were so repulsed by that, right? For us, we wanted birth to be natural and intimate and inviting and warm, and take your time, and be healthy and not around sick people and everything. And so maybe it is a very alternative-minded person that's needed to kind of reconsider the conventional approach. But both when you look throughout history and when you look at even other countries right now that are not, having huge death rates and problems and such, you got to question why we do the things we do. And the more you look in the medical establishment in Utah, the more you see the massive financial incentives that are skewing rational decision-making. I think if you remove a lot of the problems and the insurance and everything else, things would be radically different than they are today.
I hate to see the fear that accompanies people going for some of these alternatives that exist. We've done home birth as well, and I've had kids who were born in the hospital, and I've had kids born at home. It's a different experience. You're right. And it's not to say the hospital was horrible, but it's a very different experience in that home setting. And yet, it's surprising the hostility that it can elicit. People will take a very firm stand. Oh, you're putting the mother's health in danger, the baby's in danger, and there's a lot of fear about if you're not in this official environment, then it's somehow out of control.
Well, and going back to our subject about medicine being politicized, anytime you have a controversial debate or a debate about a controversial issue with someone about a political issue, let's say global warming or mandatory vaccinations, right? People go into their tribalism territory and just exactly as you say, will lash out at you. You're wrong, you're crazy, and I see the same thing with medicine, with health decisions such as home birthing. When you have an issue that has been very politicized, medical cannabis, I think again is kind of a great example. In fact, I wanted to bring up in the context of that issue being politicized, back when the federal government began to tax and regulate cannabis, the American Medical Association at the time was the only one who showed up to Congress to testify against that action, saying, well, wait a minute, you guys keep calling this stuff marijuana, it's cannabis, and it's in like half of the medications that are being used right now. Cannabis was very popular. You'd get these concoctions that, sometimes had like cocaine in them and stuff like that, right? For toothaches and so forth. It's not to say medicine has historically been perfect or whatever. We can certainly always improve. But cannabis itself was a very basic component of many medications at the time that was helping a lot of people. And the American Medical Association showed up to Congress and said, don't do this. We need to not do this. And what's interesting now that decades of new doctors have been trained within this establishment system, and marijuana has been derided as a drug, and no research has been done on cannabis because of its placement on Schedule 1. The physicians that you have today, the people in the new American, the modern American Medical Association advocate against it, or at least are extremely cautious, right? Whereas their predecessors were the ones who said, no, we need to not do this. I think of Right to Try. This is a movement that many states have been adopting, saying, look, if someone's on their deathbed, they have the right to try medications that have not had their full blessing by the FDA, but maybe they've passed the initial phase to make sure it's at least safe to ingest. So at least give them the right to try. They have no other options. And I think, well, why do you have to be on your deathbed to have some freedom?
Right.
Like that always seems so like, okay, sure, let's start there. I don't dispute that that's a good place to start. But even now, like in trying to legalize medical cannabis, there's some legislators who say, oh, well, yeah, let's do, if people are, on their deathbed and on their way out, then we'll give them that freedom. And I say, good grief, like all those principles you advocated on the campaign trail, where did those go? They don't only apply when you're, about to pass away.
There's one final thing that I'd like to suggest in terms of why it may be wise to look outside the box when it comes to medicine. And I'm going to go back to the idea of medical self-sufficiency. I think most people would agree the system isn't becoming less cumbersome over time. If you look at the paperwork, and by the way, doctors and nurses and medical professionals will attest to this. The amount of bureaucratic red tape they have to fight through is absolutely staggering, and few of them are very happy about it. But what if, for some reason, that system was not readily accessible, whether it was overloaded or there was a breakdown of some kind, and you could not access it? How prepared would you be to address minor things on your own? I mean, something like a toothache. Would you know what you could do? If your kid has a broken bone, would you know how to set that bone at least enough to give them some comfort until you could get, to medical care? I mean, I actually had a doctor teach me how to do sutures and how to put a cast on. And it's nothing I would say, oh, and I'm good at it. I'm not. Mine looked terrible. But to know that you had the skills and the necessary supplies on hand to do that could sure give you a lot of peace of mind if, for some reason, the system and its attendant bureaucracy that we've all come to count on somehow wasn't functioning.
Yeah, and I think the more we rely on centralization and division of labor, you get all these experts in these very nuanced areas, and the more removed we become from the very basic things, such as you mentioned, that we should be able to take care of. When we did home birthing, to go back to that one, and as we were tied into that community for a few years, and my wife made many connections with other people, it was amazing how empowering it was for these women to realize that their body knew what to do. Yes, there's complications sometimes, no doubt, right? Sometimes those complications are themselves a result of interventions and, giving a woman Pitocin and so forth. But even leaving a woman alone to just have her body do its thing, there are complications. And thank goodness we have, support and technology and medicine and research to intervene in those cases that are necessary. But to see that for women who maybe had trauma and doing a hospital birth and had a negative experience, to rely on their body to naturally, take care of itself was amazing. On the medical cannabis front, I only learned about this a couple of years ago, that our bodies have what is called an endocannabinoid system. At the cellular level, our bodies respond to cannabinoids. Our cells have receptors that are designed to respond to cannabinoids that our bodies naturally produce. And so here you have this plant that can supplement those cannabinoids and provide, what I understand as a non-scientist to be kind of systemic health and regulation. And to think that we haven't been researching that in America for decades because of, again, politicization, however you pronounce it, because of politics, right?
Right.
And what a travesty that is. How much suffering and death there has been that could have been spared or minimized if medicine was not politicized.
You got to promise me that we will do a podcast on medicinal cannabis in the not so distant future. I know it's going to be a huge issue in the upcoming year, and that's a topic that I think there's a lot of meat on that bone.
Let's do it. And for next time, guys, next episode is going to be, we're going to talk to Rebecca Brown from the Innocence Project, a fantastic organization you want to hear about. They do great work. We've had the good fortune of working with them a little bit. So stay tuned. This has been episode 48. So we're going to link to a couple of the issues we mentioned on societyandthestate.com/48. Until next time, we'll see you then.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.